back to the channel for another bike review. Today we're going to be breaking away from the norm a little bit and we will be taking a look at this. It's a 2005 Benelli Tornado Tre, meaning 3 or triple, Novecento, meaning 900. So I think to fully appreciate this bike you do need to understand a little bit of the story behind Benelli. So Benelli is and always has been a brand surrounded in a very rich motorcycling history. It's actually one of the oldest motorcycle manufacturers in the world and was originally founded all the way back in 1911 in Pesaro in Italy by a widow who was originally wanted to create work for her 6 sons. Benelli contributed massively to the Italian war effort during World War I, and by 1920 they had produced their own in-house engine and released their own branded Benelli motorcycle a year later. Development of different bikes would continue all the way up until World War II. Put a halt on the development of 250cc supercharged bike that Benelli were building with a hope of competing in the lightweight Adaman TT. By the end of World War II, the factory was mostly destroyed and the company was in ruins. Fortunately, the quick fix at Benelli managed to get the company back on its feet by actually salvaging old motorcycles from the battlefield and restoring them for civilian use. Benelli would continue to innovate with new motorcycles for the next 20 or so years, right the way up until the end of the 60s when the Japanese started to shake things up. Not long after this, the now struggling Benelli was sold to an Italian-Argentine industrialist. He would go on to acquire many different Italian brands such as Maserati, Moto Guzzi. A rocky few years would follow until 1995 when Benelli was again taken over, only this time with a bold new vision. Over the coming years Benelli would develop and release various small capacity bikes, generally aimed at commuters, younger riders. Benelli had a lot of success with this market. Then in 1999 Benelli hired an ex-Cagiva technician and teased us with the prospect of a racing bike, and then a few years later in 2002 they brought us this, the Tornado Tre or Triple, Benelli's first crack at a proper full-blown superbike. At the time Benelli was praised for doing things a little bit differently. A few examples of that: the radiator, which would traditionally be mounted at the front of the bike, is actually here under the seat with some big cooling fans here under the rear tail unit. Another example would be the aircraft spec glue and fittings used to hold the 4 pieces of the trellis frame together, as opposed to the traditional welding method. Again, that was to save weight. So at the heart of the bike there's an 898cc inline triple which was producing a claimed 140 brake horsepower. What's quite an interesting story behind this engine is it was actually built for a Laverda sports bike that never made it into production. Benelli at some point acquired the design for the engine and actually built it themselves for the Tornado. If you search around online you can actually find photographs of this same engine, only with orange cam covers and the Laverda logo. This particular bike is paired with a Arrow exhaust, which I'm sure is going to sound incredible being that this is a triple. For suspension we've got offerings from Marzocchi up front, so these were built by Marzocchi with a Benelli design. There was also Öhlins offerings available for a different spec version of the bike. For brakes, again, top shelf offerings from Brembo, so they're 320mm discs on 4-piston calipers. Very, very good brakes even by today's standards. So this particular Tornado has only actually covered 1,850 miles, so it's beautifully kept, absolutely pristine, a real collector's piece. With such a pristine example and with the mileage in mind, it would be a shame to pile on the miles now by me wobbling around to do this review, but I will get the bike out on the road, so we'll go out for a 20-minute, half-an-hour ride. Obviously it won't be an in-depth review, it'll be more of a first impressions, but I think it'll be enough to give you my thoughts after riding this bike. So just before we do get out on the road, as with a few other bikes that I've reviewed for this channel, this bike is here today courtesy of JD Comps, who are giving you the chance to win this stunning, pristine piece of motorcycle history. If you do want to get your name in the hat to have a go at winning this bike, I'll leave the link that you need in the description section of this video. Okay, so first impressions. Instantly recognisable as being Italian. As soon as you get onto the bike it's very, very high. I mean, I'm quite a tall rider and to be honest the bike fits me beautifully, but you are really leaned forward. It reminds me a little bit of when I did the Panigale review. It's a very similar seating position to that, where you feel like you're really kind of peering over the top of the screen. These indentations here for your legs are perfect. They sit so well in there. I'd imagine if you're on the track you'd really be able to get your legs locked into place there. Funny, as the bike was just warming up,
talking about reminiscent to a Ducati, sounds like an absolute box of spanners while it's idling. It's rattling all over the place, but the second that you give it any RPM, any at all, super smooth. Sounds fantastic as well. Listen to that triple. That sounds absolutely phenomenal. So this is actually my first time riding a triple anyway sports bike, so I was really interested to give it a go. So as I mentioned before while we were off the bike, this will be a very short review. A very short road test. Sorry if you see the mileage here, 1855. So we're on the 1851 when I picked up the bike, under strict instructions from Rob to do as minimum miles as possible. And to be honest, even without Rob saying anything, with such a low mileage bike and the age that it is, it's such a shame to put too many miles on it. Obviously this bike will be a competition prize for somebody at some stage, so it's not live on the JD Comps website just yet, but it is coming up very soon. So really, out of respect for the winner, oh, that sounds lovely. Yeah, out of respect for the winner, really, it's I won't be putting too many miles on at all. I must say, how nice are these mirrors? They remind me a lot of the F3 and F4 mirrors from MV Agusta, mounted really high on the fairing here. Obviously this top fairing here is absolutely solid. You do tend to find sometimes on sports bikes, especially modern sports bikes, it's quite flimsy up here at the top, but you can actually see a supporting rod here coming up, so obviously the mirrors have got zero vibration at all. So being in true Italian fashion, the clutch is quite heavy on the Tornado. And similar to the RSVR review that I did, getting into neutral, especially at a standstill, very difficult. As with the RSVR, there's probably a knack to it that you pick up in time, but certainly for me as a first time riding a Tornado, I found it much easier just to click it into neutral as you're rolling to a stop, rather than struggling to get it into neutral when you've already got to a stop. I must say, here at lower speeds, I expected, if I'm honest, it to be a little bit of a handful. Certainly looking at the dynamics of the bike, you know, how high you sit, how forward that you have to lean, you kind of make that preconception that it's going to be a bit of a handful to ride at slower speeds, but exact opposite. Lovely exhaust note as well, very non-offensive, very sophisticated. And now we're idling now, you know, what are we on? 3,000 RPM, 30 miles an hour. And it's just a very very pleasant purring coming from the back. So really one of the biggest things you're going to have to watch out for if you're thinking of getting a Tornado, it's just the lack of spares. And particularly lack of aftermarket parts. Other than some aftermarket screens and some aftermarket exhaust options, you're not really going to find a whole lot. Obviously with the Tornado only having such a short lifespan, wasn't really much time nor point for aftermarket teams to put any R&D into, you know, developing aftermarket products. But with that being said, you know, you've got the Marzocchi or Öhlins suspension, depending on the variant of the bike that you've gone for. Brembo brakes up front. There's not really a whole lot else that you need in ways of an upgrade. sounds just phenomenal. Absolutely beautiful. It's quite funny because obviously when Benelli released this bike, they were incredibly proud of it, and rightly so, to the extent that almost every single item you look at has a Benelli stamp on it. You know, Benelli, we've got Benelli on the fairings, got Benelli on the clutch cover, Benelli on the casings, Benelli on the side of the forks. Even the little rubber sleeves that are holding the clutch cables are stamped with the Benelli logo, and who can blame them, to be honest. I'm sure they were of the thinking that this is going to be a huge step in the right direction for them as a company. It's just so unfortunate that it never came to be for whatever reason. One thing I'm very surprised with actually, it's just how comfortable the bike is, considering how aggressive the stance of the bike is, how far forward you lean. You actually don't seem to have too much pressure on your wrist. It does feel a little bit of a handful at these slower sort of speeds. Doesn't really like those sort of sub 2000 RPM. Feels a little bit bogged down, you know, so far down in the revs, but the moment you clear it, silky smooth. So the bike is just so smooth to ride, effortless, to be honest. It's very flattering. I mean, given the mileage and the condition of the bike, and obviously we are on the road, it's been very wet, I've not been riding it very hard at all, and it just flatters you, you know. It's just as enjoyable to ride steady and smooth as I imagine it would be if you had it on the track and you could really see what it's made of. So the mileage is creeping up. I'm very, very conscious of the fact this is such a low mileage bike. So I think what we'll do is we'll find somewhere quiet up here, and I'll pull over and I'll give you the verdict after having a wobble around on this bike for the last half an hour or so.
But what an incredibly interesting bike. After riding this bike today and spending the day with it for filming purposes, it's so hard to see why this bike doesn't take off. For whatever reason, the Tornado never properly got sales traction. That might be due to the lack of main dealer support compared to its rivals. It never quite managed to match up to the allure of a Ducati, and in truth it's not quite as powerful as some of the Japanese competition at the time. The Tornado was produced all up until 2014 in various trims and guises, until Benelli pulled the plug on it to focus on different models in the range. A very sad story of what could have been, because the Tornado has an incredible amount to offer. The handling is super crisp, super light. The triple pulls hard all the way through the rev range. It really loves to rev. It's quite funny when you're sat in traffic or idling. It sounds like a box of spanners. You know, it's quite reminds me quite a bit of like a dry clutch on the Ducati, just famous for rattling. But the second you pull away and start moving, it just smooths out. Really, really lovely to ride. The styling in true Italian fashion is very, very dramatic. Every single component is beautifully finished. You know, the mirrors, all the little fittings up here, everything is just beautifully finished. A lot of attention to detail's gone into creating this bike. So in respect of character, this bike rings around any Japanese bike of the time. If you are thinking of buying one, there's not really a whole lot to be aware of. So the pre-2004 bikes were plagued with a few issues. But as I say, once we got to 2004, the majority of those were all ironed out. The biggest struggle you'll probably have is spares. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, the Benelli dealership isn't quite as established as some of the mainstream brands, and because the bike never really got traction, there's not a whole lot in the way of aftermarket parts either. With that being said, this bike has an incredible following, a big fan base. So if there's something that you're genuinely stuck with, get yourself onto the Benelli forums. For sure there'll be a knowledgeable member on there that will be able to help you out. So I guess the big question really is, would I recommend you buy a Benelli Tornado? And the answer to that really is, I should have a doubt, yes, absolutely. Don't let the bargain price that you can pick up a Tornado now fool you. This bike is and always will be a very, very premium Italian superbike. It's full of character, it's unique, bags of performance, and it will always be remembered as a bike that revived the Italian legend that is Benelli. If you made it this far, please do leave a like down below and consider subscribing to the channel for more videos just like this one. It really, really does help us out. Thanks again to JD Comps for loading us a bike. Take care. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.